1. The pickpocket. The wallet was Italian leather. Kettle could feel that much through the man's coat, the soft give of quality, the particular weight of a billfold that had never been empty. The mark was a banker or a lawyer, somebody who wore his money the way other men wore hats, without thinking about it. He stood at the edge of the crowd outside the Queen Street recruiting depot, watching young men sign their names for the Queen, and his right hand rested on a silver-topped cane while his left held a folded newspaper, and neither hand was anywhere near his inside pocket. Thomas Kettle loved men who held things with both hands. He was 20 years old, 5'8", 140 pounds, and his fingers were the most educated part of him. He'd been working the Toronto crowds since he was 14, 6 years of practice that had given him a gentle touch, a forgettable face, and an instinct for the precise moment when a man's attention was elsewhere. That moment was now. The Mark was watching a sergeant with a waxed mustache deliver a speech about duty and empire, and his eyes had gone soft with patriotic feeling, and his coat hung open like an invitation. Kettle stepped close. The brush, the dip, the pull, 3 motions that looked like one, and the wallet was in Kettle's own coat before the Mark could blink. He kept walking. Never run after a lift. Never look back. Never change your pace. Walk like a man going somewhere ordinary, because that is what you are, an ordinary man going somewhere. The wallet sat warm against his ribs. Toronto in October of 1899 had gone mad with war fever. Every pub had a recruiting poster. Every corner had a newspaper boy shouting about the Boers, about the Transvaal, about Canada sending 1,000 men to fight for the Empire at the far end of Africa. Men in half uniforms staggered through the streets, already celebrating a war that hadn't started yet. Somewhere a brass band was playing Soldiers of the Queen, and badly. Kettle could hear it between the clatter of horse-drawn carts, and the shouts of hawkers, and the general bloody uproar of a city that had discovered it wanted to fight somebody. He did not want to fight anybody. He wanted the contents of the Italian wallet, which turned out to be $11 and a carte de visite of a woman in a large hat. He kept the money and dropped the wallet in a horse trough. The photograph floated face up for a moment, the woman gazing at the sky, and then sank. $11. Good morning. He'd eat well tonight, pay a week's rent on the room above the chandler's shop on Jarvis Street, and still have enough to drink himself stupid if the mood struck. It would not strike. Kettle never drank when he was working, and he was always working. He moved west along Queen, threading through the recruiting crowds. Young men everywhere, farm boys from Ontario County, clerks in pressed collars, laborers with thick forearms and thicker accents. They were signing up for the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Canadian Regiment, or they were talking about signing up, or they were talking about how their friend was signing up, or they were drunk. The whole city had a fever, and Kettle was the only man in it who felt fine. This was, he reflected, because war was excellent for his profession. Crowds meant careless pockets. Excitement meant distracted marks. And all these fine young men lining up to volunteer were leaving behind wallets, watches, and the general inattention of a population focused on something more important than its own belongings. He ought to send the Boers a thank you letter. Then he saw the constable. Not saw, sensed. The particular quality of a gaze that wasn't casual. Kettle had been watched by policemen most of his life, and he could feel the weight of it the way a pickpocket feels leather through cloth. By instinct, by experience, by the small hairs rising on the back of his neck. He glanced left without turning his head. Constable Harris. Broad, patient as stone. He'd been closing in for 3 weeks, appearing on Kettle's usual corners, lingering outside the pub where Kettle took his breakfast, once standing across the street from the Jarvis room watching the front door for 40 minutes. He'd never caught Kettle with anything. But he was getting closer, and he was the type who didn't stop. Kettle adjusted his course. North on Yonne, away from King. Easy. Natural. Going somewhere. Harris followed. Not fast. Not obvious. But there, half a block back, weaving through the same crowds Kettle used for cover. The man had a talent for patience. Kettle respected that, one professional to another, and then he picked up his pace and felt his heart begin to thud. He turned onto Adelaide. The recruiting depot spilled soldiers and volunteers into the street in a great messy river of khaki and kit bags, and people who had no idea where they were going. Perfect cover. Kettle slipped into the crowd and kept his head down and moved fast, threading between men who were larger and louder and more visible than he would ever be. Then a hand caught his arm. Not Harris. The mark, red-faced, furious, gripping Kettle's sleeve with one hand and pointing with the other. This man stole my wallet. Kettle pulled free. The crowd turned. Faces everywhere, hostile, curious, indifferent. And behind them, closing fast, Harris. He ran. Through the depot crowd, past a wagon loaded with kit bags, across the road between two carts, down an alley that smelled of horse piss and rotting vegetables. Harris was behind him. The alley turned. Kettle turned with it. His shoes were thin leather, good for quiet walking, bad for running on cobblestones. He could hear Harris's heavier boots behind him, steady, not gaining but not falling back. The alley opened into the pub yard behind McCaffrey's. And there, slumped against the wall like something delivered and forgotten, was a man. He was young, thick-shouldered, farm stock. He wore a private's tunic, khaki brass buttons, Oliver pattern webbing, and his head lolled against the brick at an angle that meant he was either dead or spectacularly drunk. A kit bag sat beside him like a loyal dog. His rifle was propped against the wall. He smelled powerfully of whiskey. Kettle did not think. Thinking was for men who had time. His hands did the work. Tunic off the drunk, kit bag slung, cap pulled low. The drunk groaned and rolled sideways and said something about his mother. Kettle stepped over him and walked out the far end of the yard wearing another man's uniform. It did not fit. The tunic was for a man with a wider chest and shorter arms. The cap sat too low. The kit bag was heavy with things Kettle could not identify. But he was wearing khaki, and the street was full of men in khaki, and Harris was somewhere behind him looking for a civilian. He walked toward Union Station in his stolen uniform, keeping his pace steady. The tunic pulled wrong across his shoulders. The cap sat too low. Every step felt like a confession. He rounded the corner by the commissary depot and walked directly into a sergeant. The man was tall, lean, late 30s. He carried a clipboard and wore the 3 stripes of a staff sergeant, with the particular authority of a man who had been shouted at by officers and had learned to shout louder at men below him. His eyes went to Kettle's uniform and stopped there. Not casual. Assessing. Name, the sergeant said. Kettle opened his mouth. Closed it. Looked at the clipboard. The sergeant looked at the tunic, too large in the chest, too short in the sleeves. At the boots, civilian leather, not army issue. At the kit bag, which Kettle held wrong because he did not know how to hold it right. Name, the sergeant said again. Behind Kettle, boots on cobblestones. Heavy. Steady. He did not need to turn to know it was Harris. That one's mine, Sergeant. Harris's voice. Calm, satisfied. The voice of a man who had finally run his quarry to ground. Thomas Kettle. Pickpocket. I've been chasing him since Queen Street. Sergeant looked at Harris. Looked at Kettle. Looked at the uniform again. His jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. Pickpocket, the sergeant repeated. Yes, sir. Wearing a private's tunic. Stolen, sir. Off a drunk, in a pub yard. I saw the whole thing. Harris stepped closer. His hand moved to the truncheon at his belt. He's mine, Sergeant McIntyre. I'll take him from here. McIntyre. Kettle filed the name away in the part of his brain that catalogued threats. The sergeant did not move. He stood there with his clipboard and his 3 stripes and the look of a man doing arithmetic in his head. Behind him, the depot was chaos, men shouting, kit bags tumbling from wagons, a brass band murdering soldiers of the Queen. The troop train sat on the platform, steam rising, ready to leave. McIntyre looked at the train. Looked at Kettle. Looked at Harris. How old are you? McIntyre asked. Kettle blinked. 20. Can you read? Yes. Can you march? Kettle stopped. I don't know. You'll learn. McIntyre turned to Harris. I need bodies for the ship, Constable. The 2nd Battalion sails in 3 days, and we're 12 men short of quota. This one's young. He's fit. He's got both his legs. Harris stared. He's a criminal. Then he'll fit right in. McIntyre made a note on the clipboard. I'm enlisting him. You can't. I can. McIntyre's voice was flat, final. You want him off your streets, I want him on that ship. He steals a soldier's uniform, he can wear it properly. Consider it a sentence. Kettle found his voice. I don't want to enlist. Both men looked at him. Harris's expression was the satisfied look of a problem solved. McIntyre's was colder, the look of a man who had stopped caring what privates wanted sometime around 1885. You're enlisting, McIntyre said, or he's taking you to the cells. Your choice. It was not a choice. Kettle understood that much. It was a sentencing. Jail or the army. The army or jail. The arithmetic was brutal and simple, and he was on the wrong side of it. The army, Kettle said quietly. McIntyre nodded. Started writing on the clipboard. The pencil scratched. Name, age, city. Head captain doing rounds of the platform noticed the tableau. Constable, sergeant, civilian in a too big tunic. He walked over. Sergeant, what's this? McIntyre and Harris exchanged a look. A beat. Either volunteered the truth. Last-minute volunteer, sir. McIntyre's voice was flat official. Signing him up now. The captain looked at Kettle. The uniform. The boots, civilian leather, not army issue. Something off. His eyes narrowed. Kettle saw the opening. If this officer asked the wrong questions, the whole arrangement fell apart. Harris's collar, McIntyre's ultimatum, the quiet deal between a sergeant and a constable to press a pickpocket into the army. He took a breath. Deliberate. His posture shifted, shoulders square, chin lifted. When he spoke, his voice dropped into a different register. Lower, steadier, the careful cadence of a man of better standing. Sir, I apologize for the confusion. I came to the depot this morning on my own initiative. I heard about the war, heard Canada was sending men, and I simply could not stand by. Sire, measured. The young patriot. The captain softened. That's the spirit. He nodded at McIntyre and walked away. McIntyre watched the officer leave. Turned back to Kettle. His face said everything his mouth did not. He had just watched a pickpocket lie to a captain's face, and the captain had thanked him for it. Beat of silence. Harris held out his hand. Said nothing. Looked Kettle in the eye. Kettle understood. He reached into the stolen tunic. Pulled out the $11. All of it. Harris took it without counting. Pocketed it. Turned and walked back toward Queen Street without a word. Kettle watched him go. The morning's work gone. He was boarding the train with nothing. McIntyre finished writing. Get on the train. He stayed where he was, clipboard in hand, watching Kettle board, the eyes of a man who would remember all of this. The thief. The lie. The performance. The troop train was packed. Men everywhere shouting, laughing, singing. Kettle found a seat in the third carriage beside a broad, wind-reddened lad with the look of a fisherman or a farmer. The man studied Kettle's ill-fitting tunic and said nothing. The train lurched. It began to move. Heading to Quebec City, the maritime man said after a while. He had a New Brunswick accent. Ship leaves in 3 days. The Sardine-en, straight to Cape Town. Right, Kettle said, because he did not know where Cape Town was. You're with G Company? That's what they tell me. The maritime man nodded and turned back to the window. Outside, Toronto was sliding away. The platform. The depot. The constables beat, the pub on Jarvis, the alleys and horse troughs, and all the careful, crooked geography of Kettle's life. He sat there in his stolen uniform with another man's kit bag between his knees, and the train picked up speed, and Ontario rolled past the windows, and somewhere behind him, Harris was walking back to his beat, satisfied that the pickpocket problem had solved itself. Kettle knew three things. The police had caught him. He was heading to Quebec City, then to Cape Town. And all of this had happened because he'd stolen $11 from a man on Queen Street. I should have let the cops catch me. They had caught him. And it turned out that was worse than he had imagined. The train rocked. The maritime man dozed. Kettle stared at the ceiling and wondered what the punishment was for desertion in wartime. He had a strong suspicion it was worse than picking pockets. Worse than theft. Worse than anything he'd done in 6 years working the Toronto crowds. McIntyre knew his name. McIntyre knew his face. McIntyre had put him on this train personally, and McIntyre was not the type of sergeant who forgot. Kettle was trapped. He had stolen his way into the army, and now he could not steal his way out. That it was better than Harris. Probably. 2. The Sardinian. The SS Sardine Ian smelled like a barnyard that had been sealed in a tin and left in the sun. 978 men in a ship built for half that number, and every one of them seasick, sweating, or both. Kettle pressed himself against a bulkhead in the lower deck and tried to become invisible. He had been invisible his whole life. In crowds, in alleys, in the spaces between other people's attention. Toronto had 1,000 places to disappear. Doorways, lanes, the gap behind a market stall where he could step and become nobody. The Sardine and had none. It was a floating box. The corridors were narrow and the bunks were stacked 3 high, and the latrines were a horror he tried not to think about, and everywhere he went there were men checking lists, men calling roll, men counting heads. It had worked at Quebec City. 3 days of chaos at the Levis Depot, 1,000 men from 8 provinces being hammered into something resembling a regiment, and McIntyre had watched him the whole time. He couldn't run. The depot was fenced. The gates were guarded. Harris had gone back to Toronto with a satisfied report, and McIntyre owned him now. 3 days of depot drills. Kettle watched the man beside him and copied everything: when to stand, when to turn, how to hold the Lee Enfield rifle that somebody had thrust into his hands without asking his name. But the others weren't much better. Half of them were farm boys who'd never seen a uniform. The other half were city lads like him, though most of them had volunteered for better reasons. McIntyre put him on his roster personally. Wrote the name in with deliberate strokes while Kettle stood at attention. Said nothing. Just wrote. The pencil scratched. Kettle became part of G Company the way a stray dog becomes part of a household. Not chosen, not wanted, but present. From day one on the Sardinian, Kettle got every shit detail. Morning latrine shift. Watch. Watch. Morning latrine shift again. McIntyre appeared on deck or below it, roster in hand, and his eyes would find Kettle in whatever corner he tried to occupy. The sergeant never raised his voice. Never swore. He didn't need to. He had authority. Kettle, McIntyre would say. Flat. Certain. And Kettle would stand up and follow him to whatever fresh hell McIntyre had arranged. The other men saw it. They said nothing, but they saw. And when Kettle came off the latrine detail, there was a tin of something edible waiting on his bunk, and nobody admitted putting it there. The soldiers figured him out in 3 days. Thought the light, they didn't care about that. They figured out what he was, someone who could find things. Below decks, in the reeking twilight of the Sardinian's hold, he could locate an extra blanket when there were no extra blankets. He could produce tobacco when the ship's canteen was empty. He could navigate the stores and pantries and lock cupboards of an overcrowded troop ship with the same instinct that had guided him through the alleys off Yonge Street. The Toronto lad, they called him. The G Company men, mostly maritime fishermen's sons and lumbermen from New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, treated him like a useful stray, fed him, tolerated him, expected him to earn his keep. Duncan was the first to say it plainly. They were on the upper deck, leaning against the rail while the Atlantic heaved gray and endless beneath them. Duncan was a private, same as Kettle, or whatever Kettle now was. Broad across the chest, with hands roughened by rope and salt water, he had the maritime habit of saying nothing for long stretches and then saying exactly the right thing. "So where'd you really come from?" Duncan said. Toronto. That's not what I mean. Kettle looked at him. Duncan's face was open, unhurried. He'd worked boats since childhood. The sea did not reward liars or fools. I know what you are, Duncan said. Don't much care. What am I? Duncan said it without heat, like saying the sky was gray. You move like one. Watch things like one. You came aboard in a uniform that doesn't fit, and you've been lifting extras since the first night. He shrugged. I've sailed with worse. The ship rolled. Frey came over the rail and caught Kettle across the face. I had a cousin in Halifax who was the same, Duncan went on. Quick hands. Had more than he was given. Got himself killed over a bottle of rum in a chandler's shop. 40 years old. He looked at Kettle. Don't die over rum. I'll try not to. Duncan had a mother in Moncton. He mentioned her once, casually, as a fact of the world, something that existed whether you talked about it or not. She wrote him letters, he said. He read them twice because she had small handwriting, and he wasn't the fastest reader. Kettle stored the detail the way he stored everything, automatically, without knowing why. Pickpockets have it. You never know what's useful until you need it. The brandy happened on a Thursday. Kettle had found the officer's store. It was locked, but he'd been solving that problem since he was a child. He waited until the watch changed, worked the latch with a bent nail, and slipped inside. 2 bottles of Hennessy cognac sat on a shelf that had no business holding them on a troop ship full of enlisted men. He took both. The first he tucked inside his tunic, pressed against his stomach where the loose uniform hid the bulge. The ill-fitting kit, too big in the shoulders, too long in the sleeves, had been a liability at Quebec City. That was an asset. The second bottle he carried openly in his right hand. His intention was clear. Share one with G Company below decks. A nip each, enough to cut the taste of salt beef and bad water. Criminal kindness that made men loyal. The other bottle was insurance, or greed, or both. He was carrying the visible bottle along the corridor when McIntyre appeared at the far end. The sergeant stopped. Kettle stopped. The bottle was in Kettle's right hand, unconcealed. The hidden bottle pressed cold against his ribs. McIntyre's eyes went from Kettle's face to the bottle and back. Where did you get that, Private? The question hung in the corridor. Behind McIntyre, 2 soldiers appeared, saw the tableau, and went very still. Kettle did not hesitate. Hesitation was confession. He took a breath, deliberate, steadying. His posture shifted. His shoulders squared. His chin lifted. When he spoke, his voice was different, lower, steadier, with the careful cadence of a man of better standing. Not the quick street patter. Something measured. Sir. Found it rolling about below deck, Sergeant. His face was earnest, helpful, the face of a man doing a small duty. I was just taking it to Mr. MacDonnell. McIntyre's jaw worked. His eyes were flat stones. Found it, the sergeant repeated. Rolling about. Near the number 3 hold. Must have fallen from a store's crate. Kettle held the visible bottle at arm's length, offering it. Hidden bottle pressed against his stomach with every breath. Shall I take it up, Sergeant, or would you prefer to? The 2 soldiers behind McIntyre were very carefully not looking at each other. McIntyre could not prove a thing. The bottle was in Kettle's hand, yes. Kettle was standing in a corridor walking toward the officers' quarters, and his story, however transparently ridiculous, could not be disproved on the spot without searching a hold, questioning witnesses, and creating exactly the kind of fuss that officers found tiresome. Take it up, McIntyre said. Each word a separate sentence. Kettle walked past him. The hidden bottle pressed against his ribs with every step. He climbed the ladder, feeling the weight shift under his tunic, and presented the Hennessy to Lieutenant MacDonnell with the earnest air of a choir boy returning a lost hymnal. MacDonnell looked at the bottle. Looked at Kettle. His mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. Thank you, Kettle. Sir. He went back below decks. The second bottle still tucked against his stomach. Within the hour, he produced it for G's company, not explaining where it came from, not needing to, and every man in the hold knew what had happened. McIntyre's face. Kettle's composure. The absolute brazenness of a man who got caught with stolen brandy and came out ahead. They laughed quietly in their bunks. They passed the Hennessy in silence. Kettle's position was sealed. He was a scoundrel. Their scoundrel. McIntyre could not touch him. Came over the horizon on a morning of flat calm and bright sun. The Sardini and rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and the continent appeared as a dark line separating sea from sky, and 900 men pressed to the rails to look at the place where they would spend the next year of their lives. Kettle stood at the port rail with Duncan beside him. Below them, the water was the color of old brass. Above them, the sky was white. The dark line of land grew, and details emerged. Brown hills, a smudge of green, the distant glint of buildings. Duncan was not smiling. Kettle had noticed this about him. He smiled easily and often, at jokes and at idiocy, and at the general absurdity of 1,000 men on a stinking ship heading to a war most of them couldn't find on a map. But he was not smiling now. His hands rested on the rail, and his eyes were on the coast, and his face was entirely still. "Lot of empty country," Duncan said. "Looks it. My mother's last letter said the papers are calling it rough terrain." She underlined rough. He paused. "She underlines things she wants me to pay attention to." Kettle looked at Africa and tried to calculate what it meant. There would be an army, and it would march, and eventually it would fight. And somewhere in that sequence of events, Thomas Kettle Pickpocket, pressed man, enlisted by ultimatum, would be required to do something he'd never done before. He would be required to stand in a place where people were trying to kill him and not run away. He did not like his chances. McIntyre passed behind them. He said nothing. He did not need to. The look he gave Kettle as he passed carried patient certainty, a problem he intended to solve eventually. Not anger. Something worse. Certainty. "I've made a terrible mistake." Kettle gripped the rail and watched Afric grow. Duncan stood beside him, silent, the space between them filled with everything neither man was willing to say. The ship pushed toward the coast. The coast did not move. And somewhere beyond the dark line of hills, across 1,000 miles of veldt and scrub and hostile country, the Boers were waiting for them with Moser rifles and no particular desire to be part of the British Empire. Kettle had escaped the police. He had escaped every consequence he had ever earned in his 20 years. But looking at Africa, the flat line of it, the size of it, the absolute indifference of a continent that did not care about quick hands or clever lies, he had the first honest thought of his military career. He was not going to escape this. 3. Hard road north. The heat hit like a wall. Not Ontario summer. Not anything Thomas Kettle had felt in 20 years of living. A dry, alien furnace that pulled the moisture from his skin before he could blink. That turned the air into something you chewed rather than breathed. That made the inside of his tunic a private hell of sweat and wool and regret. Prison has shade. Belmont was a railway post in the middle of nothing. A few tin-roofed buildings, a water tank, sidings full of supply wagons, and around it in every direction the South African felt flat, brown, and hostile as a headmaster's stare. Battalion arrived by rail from the Aire and Orange River, and Kettle stepped off the train into the white glare and thought, "I have made a series of decisions, each worse than the last, and this is where they've delivered me." Nobody was shooting at him. And for Thomas Kettle, that was paradise. Garrison duty at Belmont turned out to be the most boring work in the British Empire. They guarded the railway. They walked pickets around the perimeter. They drilled, they cleaned weapons they hadn't fired, they dug latrines and filled latrines and dug more latrines in an endless cycle of holes in the African earth. It was dull, repetitive, and absolutely safe, and Kettle was quietly, privately, shamefully delighted. Because garrison duty was a system, and systems were what Kettle understood. Within the first week, he had mapped the supply chain. The rations came by rail: tinned bully beef, hard biscuit, tea. Adequate. But there were gaps in the system, places where things could be improved by a man with quick hands and no particular attachment to the rules. He found a source of tinned potted meat in a supply wagon that was being poorly supervised by a transport corps private who went behind the water tank every afternoon for a smoke. He located extra blankets in a store's tent, whose inventory hadn't been checked since the battalion arrived. He discovered that the officers' mess received a separate ration of condensed milk, and that the crate it came in was left unattended for 30 minutes each Tuesday morning. Company ate better than any other company in the battalion. Nobody asked why. Nobody asked where the extra rations came from, or how Kettle always seemed to have tobacco when the canteen was empty, or why his section's tea tasted different from everyone else's. They ate, they smoked, and they treated Kettle with tolerant affection. "You're a criminal," Duncan observed one evening, watching Kettle produce a tin of sardines from thin air. "I'm resourceful." "You're a criminal who's resourceful. There's a difference. The difference is you're eating sardines." Duncan ate the sardines. McIntyre watched all of this with the concentrated fury of a man who knows a crime is being committed but cannot find the evidence. He assigned Kettle to latrine duty again. He assigned him to the dawn water run again. He inspected Kettle's kit with a thoroughness that bordered on archaeology, turning out every pocket, checking every fold, running his hands along seams and linings as though searching for contraband sewn into the fabric. He found nothing. Kettle was too good for that. The officers loved McIntyre. Lieutenant Colonel Otter himself had noted the sergeant's efficiency during an inspection, and the compliment had rippled through the company like a stone dropped in a puddle. McIntyre's section was the cleanest. His men were the most punctual. His equipment was the most properly maintained. He ran G Company's enlisted men with the precision of a Swiss clock, and the officers approved, and the soldiers wished him a creative and lingering death. "Officer's pet," a private named Henley muttered one evening, watching McIntyre march past, after yet another kit inspection that had found nothing wrong and left McIntyre visibly dissatisfied. "He's right about me, though," Kettle said. "Because he was honest about that, at least." "Of course he is. That's what makes it worse." Duncan laughed. Soldiers share that laugh when the army has beaten them into a shape they recognize, the shape of men who endure grinding nonsense together and bond through their shared contempt for the man who grinds them. Near miss came on a Tuesday. Kettle had lifted a tin of the officer's condensed milk, just one, enough for G Company's tea without making the shortage obvious. He was returning to the lines from the direction of the store's tent when McIntyre materialized around the corner of a supply wagon. They stood 6 feet apart. McIntyre's eyes went to Kettle's hands, empty. He'd passed the tin to Duncan 30 seconds earlier, the pickpocket's instinct for a handoff, then to his face, then to the direction he'd come from. "What are you doing here, Kettle?" "Latrine detail, Sergeant." "Coming back?" "The latrines are south. You came from the east." "Must have got turned around, Sergeant. All looks alike out here." McIntyre's face was a monument to suppressed certainty. He knew. He could not prove it. He checked Kettle's hands again, empty, open, nothing. He looked at Kettle's pockets, flat, innocent, containing nothing more suspicious than a handkerchief and the stub of pencil. "Kit inspection," McIntyre said. "Now." They walked to Kettle's bunk. McIntyre went through everything. Every item. Every pocket. The seams of the kit bag. The inside of the cap. The soles of the boots. Nothing. There was nothing to find because there was nothing there, because Thomas Kettle had learned at 14 that the first rule of theft was to never hold the merchandise longer than you had to. McIntyre stood in the tent with empty hands and a face like thunder. Somewhere outside, Duncan was making tea with condensed milk. "Back to your duties, Kettle." "Sergeant." Kettle walked out into the sun. He did not smile. Smiling would be evidence. Word about Sunnyside reached Belmont 3 days after New Year's. His company, under Captain Barker, had fought an action on January the 1st, attached to a column under Colonel Pilcher. The details filtered through the battalion in fragments. A Boer position, a dawn attack, casualties. Real combat. The first time any Canadians in South Africa had been shot at. Men clustered around the messenger like pigeons around bread. The talk was excited, envious, nervous. Some of them wanted to have been there. Some of them were glad they hadn't. Most of them felt both things at once, and the feeling came out as restless energy, as loud opinions, as the particular bravado of soldiers who haven't fought yet. Kettle felt none of this. He stood at the edge of the group, arms folded, and listened to the details with the detached attention of a man hearing about someone else's misfortune. Had been shot at. Men had shot back. Nobody in C Company had been killed, but the Boers had, and the reality of actual bullets hitting actual bodies settled over the garrison like a change in the weather. Duncan found him afterward, sitting on an ammunition crate behind the cookhouse. "You'll get your turn," Duncan said. "I'd rather not." Duncan looked at him. Kettle looked back. "Most men here wish they'd been at Sunnyside," Duncan said. "Most men here are idiots." Duncan laughed. Not a big laugh. He wasn't a big laugher, but enough. Then orders came. They came down through the chain the way Army orders always do. Silently at the top, then louder at each level, then deafening by the time they reached the soldiers. The battalion was to move. They would join the 19th Brigade under Major General Smith-Dorrien. They were going north, into the field, into the part of South Africa where the war was actually happening. The garrison days were over. Kettle packed his kit. His hands, the same hands that had picked a wallet on Queen Street in what felt like another lifetime, were shaking. Not badly. Not visibly. But he could feel the tremor as he folded his spare shirt and checked his ammunition pouches and tightened the straps of the kit bag he had stolen from a drunk man in a Toronto pub yard. Duncan packed beside him. Steady. He had looked at Africa without smiling, and was now folding his blanket with the careful movements of preparation, the only prayer a soldier had. McIntyre came through the tent, checking kit. He stopped at Kettle's bunk, looked at the pack, looked at Kettle. "Look alive, Kettle," he said. "We're going to war." The satisfaction in his voice was barely concealed. In garrison, Kettle could hide. In garrison, there were supply wagons to raid and store tents to rob and 1,000 small corners where a scoundrel could disappear. At war, there would be none of that. At war, McIntyre would have him. He thought of Constable Harris. 6 months in the Don jail. That was what Constable Harris had been building toward. 6 months for petty theft, maybe a year if the magistrate was in a bad mood. A cell with a roof. 3 meals. Bed. Walls between him and anyone who wanted to shoot him. Instead, he was packing a stolen kit bag in South Africa, heading north into a war he didn't understand, against an enemy he'd never seen, because 4 months ago he'd stolen a wallet on Queen Street and a sergeant had given him a choice between jail and the Canadian Army. The tent flap stirred in the hot wind. Outside, men were forming up. NCOs were shouting. Somewhere, a mule brayed a miserable, angry sound that Kettle found deeply sympathetic. The veldt stretched north toward the horizon, brown and flat and empty, and somewhere out there the Boers were waiting with Moser rifles and the high ground and every possible advantage over a pickpocket from Toronto who should never have been here in the first place. Kettle shouldered his kit. Duncan fell in beside him. McIntyre was already ahead, straight-backed, satisfied, walking toward the war like a man going home. I should have let the cops catch me. 4. Silent march. Grass pan. The battalion fell in beside the Gordon Highlanders, and Kettle took one look at the Scots and understood exactly where the Canadians stood in the British Army's pecking order. The Gordons were lean, sunburnt, silent. They had been campaigning since the autumn. They wore their sun helmets with the casual indifference of men who had forgotten what shade felt like. Their kit was worn smooth. Their rifles were dark with oil and handling. Sergeant with a face like boiled leather and a mustache that could have been used to clean rifle bores glanced at the Canadians as they filed past, and his expression was the expression of watching livestock being delivered. Kettle decided he did not like the punchline. Beside the Gordons stood the Duke of Cornwall's light infantry and the Shropshire's more professional soldiers, more lean faces, more rifles that had been fired in anger. The 19th Brigade was assembling under Smith-Dorrien, and into this formation of regulars walked the 2nd Battalion, Royal Canadian Regiment, colonial volunteers, garrison soldiers, men who had guarded a railway for 2 months and never been shot at. 31 officers and 865 other ranks marching into the brigade with the careful dignity of men who know they are being watched and measured and found wanting. McIntyre seized the march as an opportunity. Kettle, extra water detail. Before the column had formed. Kettle, you're carrying the section's spare rations. Before the first mile. Kettle, ammunition resupply, rear to front. Before the first halt. Always with justification. Always professional. McIntyre could not catch Kettle stealing. So he did the next best thing. He loaded him until he broke. Kettle did not break. Not on the first day. The pickpocket's instinct for energy conservation was an unlikely military asset. He knew how to pace himself, how to save water instead of drinking it all in the first hour, how to walk with his weight forward and his steps short and let the ground do the work. The farm boys from New Brunswick, stronger than Kettle, but trained to push through obstacles rather than around them, burned harder and faster. By the afternoon halt, 3 men in G Company had fallen out. Kettle was still walking. "How are you still going?" Duncan asked, red-faced, breathing hard. "I don't waste effort." "You don't waste anything." "It's a talent." But Botterfowl broke the talent. The battalion hauled naval guns forward. 12-pounders, massive things, iron and wood and weight that did not care about pacing or conservation. Ropes across shoulders. Men as oxen. Kettle put his back into the harness and pulled until his palms bled and his vision went gray at the edges and his legs shook with a tremor that had nothing to do with fear. Around him, men grunted and strained and cursed. The wheels turned slowly through dust that rose in clouds and coated everything, eyes, teeth, the inside of lungs. A man beside Kettle, a thick-armed lumberman from somewhere north of Fredericton, made a sound like something tearing and sat down in the dust and did not get up. Nobody stopped. There was no time to stop. The guns had to move because Roberts said the guns had to move, and Roberts was the kind of general who sent orders the way God sent weather, from a great height, without consultation, and with an expectation of obedience. McIntyre was behind him. "Keep up, Kettle," said without heat. The sergeant was suffering too. Everyone was. His face was the color of bad brick, and sweat had drawn channels through the dust on his neck, and his breathing was careful. He would not allow himself to be seen struggling. He was not superhuman. He was a man on the same march, drinking the same bad water, hauling the same ropes. But he would not let Kettle see it as weakness, and he would not let up. "Keep up, Kettle," as though Kettle had been falling behind. He hadn't. But the words were the point, the constant, grinding reminder that the sergeant was there watching, waiting for the moment when Kettle's composure cracked. Duncan passed him a canteen, wordless, steady. Kettle drank. The water was warm and tasted of metal. He handed it back. "I stole a wallet on Queen Street," he said. Duncan looked at him. "That's how I got here. I stole a wallet on Queen Street, and now I'm pulling a cannon across Africa for the Queen of England." "Shut up and walk," Duncan said. Kettle shut up and walked. The night march started at dusk on February the 17th and did not end until dawn. 23 miles. Rear guard. In darkness so complete that Kettle could not see the man ahead of him. He navigated by sound, boots on hard ground, the clink of equipment, the occasional muttered curse when someone stumbled over nothing and everything. The stars overhead were thick and bright and completely useless. They told him he was in the southern hemisphere, which was information he did not need. He considered falling out. Not as a whim. As a genuine, calculated assessment of his options. In Toronto, when things went wrong, you disappeared. Into a crowd, an alley, a doorway. Into the gaps that a city provided and a pickpocket exploited. You became nobody. You went somewhere else. You waited until the trouble passed, and then you resumed your life. But the veldt had no crowds. No alleys. No doorways. In every direction, for as far as the darkness extended, there was nothing, flat ground, scrub, silence. If he fell out, he would sit in the dark until the sun came up, and then he would sit in the sun until he died of thirst. There were no buildings. There were no roads. There was no civilization in any direction that he could reach on foot with a canteen of water and legs that had stopped working properly 3 hours ago. The temperature had dropped. The veldt, which tried to boil you during the day, tried to freeze you at night, The cold crept in through the wool tunic and settled in his joints. Somewhere ahead, a man coughed a deep, wet sound that went on too long. Leather creaked. Canteen sloshed against someone's hip. The army was the only thing keeping him alive. The institution he had blundered into while running from the police, the institution he had lied his way into, stolen from, and resented every day since, was now the only thing between him and death by exposure on the South African veldt. Without the army, there was no water, no food, no direction, and no point. The irony was so perfect that Kettle would have laughed if he'd had the energy. I should have let the cops catch me. Prison has beds, he thought. Prison has walls. Prison has a ceiling between you and whatever this sky is trying to do to you. McIntyre somewhere behind. Close up, Kettle. Even in the dark. Even now. Even on a march that was destroying every man in the column, the sergeant had enough left to find Kettle and prod him. The voice came out of the blackness like a curse, and Kettle hated it, and he walked faster because hating McIntyre was the only fuel he had left. Hours passed. His feet were raw. Blisters had formed, burst, formed again on top of the first ones. His shoulders ached from the kit bag, from the rifle, from the extra rations McIntyre had assigned him at Grasspan. His legs moved without instruction, mechanical, independent, nothing to do with him. Men fell out around them. He could hear them going, the stumble, the thud of a body hitting ground, the silence that followed. Nobody stopped. The column was a river of exhausted men, and like a river it flowed around its obstacles and continued. Duncan marched beside him. Grim-faced, breathing hard, but upright. This was another storm. At some point in the last hour, his hand had found the strap of Kettle's kit bag and stayed there, steadying, not pulling. He did not speak. He did not need to. Kept walking. Dawn came gray, gradual, like a headache. The light seeped into the sky, and the veldt emerged from darkness, brown, flat, familiar in its hostility. And there, ahead, was the Paardeberg River, a dark line of water and trees cutting across the plain. Paardeberg drift. Kettle's legs stopped. He stood swaying, barely upright, looking at the river. Around him the column slowed and contracted as men reached the end of the march, and discovered that arriving was not the same as resting. Then he heard the gunfire. Not close. A mile, maybe two, ahead and to the right. The flat, sustained crackle of rifles, not volleys, not training, but the continuous fire of men trying to kill each other. It came across the veldt like a distant argument, and Kettle listened to it with the absolute clarity that exhaustion sometimes brings, the moment when the body is too tired to lie to itself. They were not going to rest. They were going straight in. Mac Don L passed word forward. Duncan looked at Kettle. Kettle looked at the river, at the thin trees, at the smoke rising beyond the ridge. His hands that had started all of this were shaking. The column began to move again. Kettle moved with it. There was nothing else to do. 5. Bloody Sunday. The Paardeberg River at dawn looked like nothing. Flat ground, scrub, a line of trees along the bank, pale sky streaked with light that meant the day would be hot, and the day after that would be hotter. Few kopjes broke the horizon. Beyond the trees, smoke, thin columns of it rising and drifting, marking the place where 4,000 Boers under Piet Cronje had dug themselves into the riverbed, and the banks and the Ullacher beyond. It looked like a field. A large, empty, featureless field. Kettle stood at the edge of it and thought, this doesn't look like a battlefield. It looks like a place where you graze cattle. Cattle that you didn't particularly like. He had been awake for 30 hours. His legs were stumps. His feet were bleeding inside his boots. He had marched 23 miles in the dark, and his reward was this, a field that smelled of dust and cordite and the faint, sweet stink of something dead. They were not given time to rest. Orders came down the line before the column had finished contracting. Move forward, support the brigade, take up positions on the north bank. Kettle filled his canteen at the river. The water was brown and tasted of mud, and something underneath the mud that he chose not to identify. He drank it because there was nothing else. Dan L. led G Company forward. The lieutenant was calm, the particular calm of a man who has decided that being calm is part of his job and will remain calm until the job kills him. Behind Mac Don L, the men of G Company spread out and moved toward the sound of the guns. I survived a 23-mile march, and my reward is getting shot at. The British Empire has a poor sense of gratitude. Where is the exit? Is there an exit? There is no exit. McIntyre was behind him. Of course McIntyre was behind him. The sergeant moved through the company like a sheepdog, keeping men in line, keeping them spaced, keeping them moving. Eyes front, Kettle, said Low Professional. The antagonism was still there, but McIntyre had a job now, and the job was keeping these men alive, and that included Kettle. They moved into the open ground. The first shot came from nowhere. Kettle heard it before he understood it, a flat crack higher and faster than any sound he'd heard on the rifle range at Belmont. A Moser round. It passed to his left, close enough that the air moved against his ear, and buried itself in the ground behind him with a sound like a fist hitting a table. He dropped. Everyone dropped. The instinct was universal. The ground was safety. The ground was cover. The ground was the only thing between a man's body and the bullet that was looking for it. Then the world came apart. The Boer rifles opened in earnest. Not a volley, a sustained cracking storm of fire that came from the tree line, from the riverbank, from positions that Kettle could not see and could not have identified if he'd seen them. The Boers fired from cover, and the Canadians were in the open, and the mathematics of that arrangement were simple and terrible. Hidden men could see exposed men, and the exposed could see nothing except muzzle flashes and dust. Sergeant Scott was the first man Kettle watched die. Scott had been standing a moment before, or kneeling, or doing some ENCO thing that required him to be upright when every instinct screamed to be flat. Bullet took him. Kettle saw the impact. A jerk, sudden, mechanical, the way a puppet moves when you tug the string too hard. Scott folded. He went to his knees and then to his side, and then he was on the ground, and the particular quality of his stillness was different from the stillness of a man taking cover. It was final. That was the sound, Kettle would later think. Not the crack of the Moser. Not the snap of rounds passing overhead. The sound that changed everything was the absence of sound, a man who had been breathing, giving orders, existing in the world, and then was not. The sudden, total silence of a body that had stopped being a person. Dunnigan was next. Or Donegan was at the same time. Kettle couldn't tell. Time had done something peculiar. It had simultaneously slowed to a crawl and accelerated past his ability to track it. Donegan was a private. Kettle didn't know him well, a quiet man, PEEI or New Brunswick, and he took a round in the head and stopped being a quiet man from PEEI or New Brunswick and became a shape on the ground. Lieutenant Mason was hit. Kettle heard the shout, "Mason's down," and turned his head enough to see men pulling an officer toward cover. Chest wound. Lung. The officer was breathing in a way that sounded wet, and Kettle looked away because looking at it was worse than hearing it. Sergeant Sippy was hit in the foot and cursed with such fluency and volume that for a moment the battle seemed to pause and listen. Kettle pressed his face into the dirt. The taste of South Africa was in his mouth, dry, mineral, the dust of a continent that did not know his name and did not care. He lay flat with his elbows dug in and his rifle out in front of him, and he fired. He fired at the tree line because every man around him was firing at the tree line. He did not aim. He did not know what he was aiming at. The Boers were invisible. They fired from pits and trenches and behind rocks and ant hills, and the only evidence of their existence was the ceaseless crack of Moser rounds and the occasional puff of smoke from a position that was too far away and too well concealed to hit. He was hiding behind a rifle. The thought arrived with the clarity of a signpost. I am hiding behind a rifle. I am lying in the dirt, firing at nothing, hiding behind a piece of wood and metal, and if I stand up, I will die, and if I stay here, I will die, and the only difference is the timing. McIntyre's voice cut through the noise. Fire and adjust, Kettle. The sergeant was functioning. In the chaos, in the smoke, in the killing ground that the open felt had become, McIntyre was doing his job. He was moving along the line, keeping men firing, keeping heads down, directing fire at positions he could identify even if Kettle couldn't. His voice was steady, professional. Kettle hated him for it. He hated McIntyre's composure, his competence, his ability to function while Kettle's brain had seized like a rusted lock. The sergeant was good at this. Kettle was not. And the hatred was a small, useful thing, because it occupied the part of Kettle's mind that would otherwise have been screaming. He fired again. The rifle kicked against his shoulder. The bullet went toward the tree line, where it either hit a boar or hit the tree, or hit the ground or went to God, and Kettle did not know which and did not care. He worked the bolt and fired again because that was what the man beside him was doing, and the man beside him was doing it because that was what the man beside him was doing, and the entire line was a chain of terrified men performing the mechanics of killing without knowing if they were killing anything. Duncan was on his left. Duncan lay flat, worked his bolt, fired, worked his bolt, fired. His face was closed, not terrified, not calm, but locked into narrow focus. He was a boat in a storm, doing the one thing boats in storms do, staying upright. A glance passed between them. Brief, hard. Duncan's eyes said, "We're still here." Then he turned back to his rifle, and Kettle turned back to his, and the battle went on. By afternoon, the assault had failed. Everywhere. British forces had attacked across the mortar and frontal assaults that cost hundreds of casualties and gained nothing. The Boers had not moved. Cronjes-el-Ager was a fortress, 4,000 men dug into the riverbed with clear fields of fire, and every attempt to cross the open ground had been met with the flat, accurate fire of men who had been shooting since childhood. The Canadians held their positions on the north bank. They had not advanced. They had not retreated. They had lain in the dirt and fired at an enemy they could not see, and some of them had been killed, and some of them had been wounded, and the rest of them were alive because the ground was flat, and they had stayed flat on it. Evening came. Firing died to single shots, desultory, the shooting of men too tired to stop, but too cautious to commit. The sun went down, and the light drained from the felt, and the dead lay where they had fallen because nobody could reach them without being shot. Kettle lay in a shallow scrape, not a trench, not a hole, just a depression in the earth that he had clawed with his hands and his bayonet during the afternoon. The scrape was perhaps 8 inches deep. It was the most valuable piece of real estate he had ever occupied. It arrived as an arithmetic problem, the kind of problem a pickpocket understands. I spent my whole life running from things. The police. The landlord. Work. Consequences. Every problem I ever had, I ran from. And running always worked. Until now. I ran from Harris and ended up on a train. I ran from the train and ended up on a ship. I ran from the ship. No, I didn't run from the ship. There was nowhere to run on the ship. And there is nowhere to run here. Prison would have been a sentence with an end date. 6 months. A year. You serve the time, and then you walk out, and the world is still there. This has no end date. This is a field in Africa where men die, and tomorrow I will still be here, and the day after that, and the day after that, and the day after that, until either the Boers stop shooting or I stop breathing. I'm going to die in Africa because I stole a wallet on Queen Street. His hands were raw from clawing the scrape. The dirt under his nails was African. The thought sat down in him and refused to move. Darkness came fully. The stars appeared, the same southern stars he'd seen on the night march, cold and useless. The river ran somewhere to his right, invisible in the dark. Wounded men called from the ground between the lines. Voices in the darkness, asking for water, asking for help, asking for things that nobody could provide because moving toward them meant dying. Duncan, lying in the scrape beside him, reached over and gripped Kettle's arm. Once. Hard. Grip of a fisherman's hand, rough, strong, storm-hardened. He held on for 3 seconds and then let go. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. Kettle lay in his scrape and stared at the sky and listened to the wounded and felt, for the first time in his life, the complete absence of options. There was no crowd to disappear into. No alley to slip down. Uniform to steal, no lie to tell, no performance that would charm an officer into letting him go. There was only the dirt and the dark and the sound of men dying, and tomorrow the sun would come up and it would start again. He was a pickpocket under siege. The comic voice, the voice that had narrated his life since Toronto, that had found the joke in every situation, that had turned fear into wit and disaster into punchlines, was quiet. For the first time since he'd stolen a wallet on Queen Street, Thomas Kettle had nothing funny to think. He closed his eyes. The darkness behind his eyelids was the darkness in front of them. The Modder River ran. Wounded called. The siege had begun. I wonder if the constable is still looking for me. 6. Stench of the Modder. The flies woke him. Not the sun, not the crack of a Moser, not McIntyre's boot in his ribs. Flies. Sound like the whole riverbank humming, thick and steady, as if the air itself had learned to vibrate. Kettle opened his eyes to the third day of the siege, and the first thing that hit him was the smell. He'd grown up in the back lanes of Toronto. He knew what dead things smelled like: rats behind the boarding house, the occasional horse left too long on King Street in August. This was different. This was industrial. The sweet, gagging rot of a river full of things that used to be alive, baked by a South African sun that did not care what it cooked. He knelt at the Modder to fill his canteen. Something bumped against his knuckles under the brown surface. Soft. Heavy. Not a rock. He did not look. I've stolen wallets, watches, and a military uniform. I draw the line at drinking a dead ox. He drank the dead ox anyway. There was nothing else. The comic voice had come back. Somewhere between the paralyzed silence of Bloody Sunday and the third morning of lying in a shallow scrape while men fired at positions they couldn't see, the running commentary in his head had reassembled itself. But it was different now. The jokes from Belmont, the garrison humor of a man stealing tinned beef for laughs, were gone. What replaced them was darker. Everything was going to be terrible forever, and the only options were laugh or scream. Kettle chose to laugh. Quietly. Inside his own skull. Where no one could hear. By the fourth day, he'd worked out a system. Before dawn, while the Boer snipers were still cold and the current ran fastest, he'd crawl upstream along the north bank to a stretch where the river narrowed between two rocks. The water moved quicker there. Marginally less poison. Marginally less dead. The whole Modder was contaminated. Cronjes Allager sat upstream like a dam of filth, and everything that died in or near it drifted down to the Canadians. He filled 8 canteens that morning, shared them with the section. Nobody asked where the water came from or why Kettle's knees were muddy before sunrise. They never asked. The soldiers had learned the same lesson the pickpockets of Toronto knew. Don't look at the hands. Just take what's offered. Duncan's cough started on the 4th day. Dry, persistent. Sound like tearing paper, quiet enough that most men wouldn't notice. Kettle noticed. He'd spent his life reading people, the twitch of a hand toward a breast pocket, the shift of weight that meant a man was about to turn. Reading Duncan's face was easier than reading a mark's. The cough. The pallor under the sunburn. Small sips of water, as if his throat was fighting him. You all right? Duncan looked at him. Fine. He was not fine. Kettle said nothing more. Word came down the line. Captain Arnold had died. Not killed in battle, a wound from the 18th that had gone septic. 5 days of festering in the heat and the flies. The line between combat death and disease death had stopped meaning anything. McIntyre arrived at Kettle's position like weather, inevitable and unwelcome. Kettle. Water detail. I just filled the section's canteen, Sergeant. Did I ask what you just did? Water detail. Officer's mess. Move. Kettle went. He always went. McIntyre was haggard now, the clean-shaved efficiency of the Sardinian ground down to stubble and red-rimmed eyes, but the relentlessness was undimmed. 9 days of siege had not dented the sergeant's commitment to making Kettle's life specifically, personally worse. The man is dying like the rest of us, and his last act on earth will be assigning me to carry water. He filled the officers' canteens from the Modder. Something bumped his hand again. He didn't look. He'd stopped looking on day 2. On the way back, he passed the officers' stores, the sorry collection of crates under a tarpaulin that wouldn't have passed for a supply depot in a Toronto alley. His hands moved before his brain gave permission. Tin of tobacco. Small, flat, officer's quality. Into his tunic in the smooth motion of a lifetime's practice. He shared it that evening, rolled cigarettes for the section with the stolen tobacco and the last of someone's newspaper. The men smoked in silence, cupping the glow below the trench lip. Nobody asked where the tobacco came from. The pickpocket's economy. He stole, they benefited. The question was never posed. I used to steal wallets on Queen Street. Now I'm stealing tobacco in a trench in Africa and sharing it with men who might be dead tomorrow. The British Empire has a poor sense of career progression. Duncan smoked half a cigarette. Coughed. Put it out. On February 24th, they pulled the battalion back to Paardeberg Drift for rest. The word rest, Kettle was learning, meant something specific to any army based on the British regimental system. It meant a different kind of misery. The rest area was a quagmire. Rain had turned the ground behind the lines to knee-deep mud. There was no shelter. Then the orders came, clear the river. Dead animals and other things had dammed sections of the Modder. The water supply, such as it was, needed to flow. Work parties, shovels, ropes. Kettle found himself waist-deep in the mud or hauling a bloated ox carcass with 3 other men from G Company. Ox had been in the river for days. It was swollen to twice its living size, and the smell was a physical force, a thing that pushed against his face like a hand. His boots slid on the riverbed. Something soft shifted under his right foot. He did not investigate. My hands lift wallets, not dead livestock. The irony of doing manual labor for free in Africa is not lost on me. McIntyre was on the detail too, hauling. Waist deep in the water, pulling the rope. He did not stand on the bank and watch. Whatever else Kettle hated about the man, and the list was comprehensive, McIntyre did the work. He hauled alongside the soldiers because the work needed doing, and he was a soldier. The ox shifted. One of the men, a private from New Brunswick whose name Kettle had forgotten, made a noise that was halfway between a gag and a laugh. Things got more fight in it dead than the lot of us alive. The men laughed. Harsh, harsh. The punchline was killing them. Even McIntyre's mouth twitched. For one moment, 1 second in a week of war, they were all just men in a river pulling a dead animal, and the hierarchy meant nothing. Move it, Kettle. You're not here to gawp. The moment passed. McIntyre was McIntyre again. Duncan worked beside him, pale, sweating despite the cold river. The cough was worse, deeper, wetter. Hauled the rope with hands that shook. We drank from this yesterday, Duncan said. No emotion. Just the fact. Duncan looking at water and knowing what was in it. Kettle looked at the brown surface around his waist. The dead ox. The things he couldn't see and didn't want to think about. The river was killing them. Not the Boers, not the Mosers, not the siege, not the heat. The river. The only water they had. Don Jail has clean water. Don Jail has walls between you and men who are trying to kill you. Don Jail has a doctor. Don Jail doesn't have a river full of dead things that you have to drink because the British Empire couldn't be bothered to bring its own. Evening, February 25th. The men sat in the quagmire trying to dry out, eat, sleep, the 3 activities that Paardeberg Drift made equally impossible. Kettle sat with Duncan near what had been a campfire before the rain put it out. Duncan ate something. Not much, half a biscuit, a mouthful of bully beef, something. He made a dry comment about the ox, heavier dead than my father's boat, and it smelled worse. Kettle watched him and felt something loosen in his chest. A flash of the steady man from the Sardinian and the quiet maritime voice, the dry understatement that had made Kettle laugh on the ship's rail when neither of them had any business laughing. Duncan was still in there, under the pallor and the sweat and the cough. Then the cough came back, deep, rattling. Duncan bent forward, and his whole body worked to produce the sound. Sweat on his forehead despite the cold. He spat into the mud and sat back. He had stopped eating again. MacDonnell moved through the bivouac. The battalion relieves the Duke of Cornwall's light infantry in the forward trenches, closer to the Boers. Such as it was over after less than 2 days. Kettle absorbed it. Forward, backward, the arithmetic didn't change. The trenches, the water, all of it the same. The only thing that changed was distance from the Boers, and the Boers were not the enemy that was winning. He looked at Duncan. Pale. Sweating. Something was wrong with him, and they both knew it. But there was no time for that. There was never time. Thomas Kettle, pressman, persistent scrounger, was still here, still drinking the water, still alive. For now. 7. Dark night. Duncan vomited into the trench. Quietly. Turned away from the section, braced one hand on the parapet, and was sick while trying very hard not to be noticed. Kettle noticed. The set of the shoulders. The tremor in the hand. Duncan stayed braced against the trench wall a beat too long before straightening up and wiping his mouth on his sleeve like nothing had happened. Kettle had been reading people since he was 14. A mark's hand drifting to a breast pocket. Constable's weight shifting before he turned. The 1,000 small signals that meant opportunity or danger, and the ability to tell the difference in half a second. What he read in Duncan's face was neither. The gray look of being eaten from the inside. The fever sheen on his forehead. The hollows under his eyes that hadn't been there a week ago. 9 days of drinking the Modder River, and the river was collecting its bill. He's my only friend. Not in the sentimental sense, in the practical sense. He's the man who knows I'm a fraud and doesn't care. He's the man who hands me his canteen without asking why. He's the man who would lie for me to McIntyre if I needed him to. Duncan goes down. I'm a pickpocket alone in an army that will eat me alive. You all right? Duncan looked at him. The look said, don't. I'm fine. He was not fine. But the field hospital was where men went and didn't come back, and Duncan was maritime stubbornness that had kept him marching beside Kettle through 23 miles of night, that had put his hand on Kettle's arm in the dark on Bloody Sunday. He would rather die on his feet than lie down and admit what the water was doing to him. McIntyre passed through the section. Even the sergeant's face had gone gray since the siege began. The clean efficiency of the Sardine and was months ago. What remained was a haggard professional who ran on discipline like a wound clock mechanism still turning, case wearing through. McIntyre looked at Duncan. One look. Something moved behind the sergeant's eyes, something that might have been concern if you caught it at the right angle and were generous enough to call it that. Keep your section in order, Kettle. He moved on. There was a war to fight. There were always wars to fight. There was always a reason not to stop and look at the thing that was killing your men. MacDonnell came through a few minutes later. The lieutenant saw Duncan's condition, noted, catalogued, weighed against the operational need for every man standing. He said nothing. The war needed bodies, even the ones that were failing. By noon, they were moving forward. The battalion marched up to relieve the Duke of Cornwall's light infantry in the forward trenches. 600 yards from the Boer positions, close enough to hear voices on the wind, close enough that a good Moser shot didn't need luck. The Cornwalls looked hollowed out. They had the stare Kettle had started to recognize soldiers who had been too close to the enemy for too long and had stopped bothering to be afraid because fear required energy they didn't have. Cornwall NCO, handing off the trench section to McIntyre, looked at Duncan. The pallor. The sweat. He gripped his rifle like it was holding him up, rather than the other way around. Your water's no better than ours, then. The G Company men laughed. Short, harsh. They knew the punchline was in their canteens. Duncan managed something that was almost a smile, the ghost of the dry maritime expression that had made Kettle laugh on the Sardinian. Even McIntyre didn't tighten his mouth. For a moment, 2 units who had never met shared the gallows understanding of what the Modder was doing to everyone who touched it. Then the Cornwalls moved out. One looked back. Good luck, Canada. He said it like he meant it. Like he was glad to be leaving and sorry to hand it to someone else. By noon, the Canadians were settled in. Kettle pressed himself against the trench wall and measured distances like he used to measure the gap between a mark's pocket and his fingers. 600 yards. I used to be able to cross that distance on a Toronto street in about 2 minutes, and the worst thing at the other end was a constable. Here, the worst thing at the other end is 1,000 Boers with Mosers, and they've had 9 days to find the range. Firing exchanges through the afternoon. Desultory at first, a crack from the Boer lines, an answer from somewhere down the Canadian trench, then silence. Then less desultory. Rounds snapping overhead. Dirt kicking up from the parapet. A man 2 sections over was hit, a sharp cry, and then the sound of a stretcher being called. Duncan was beside him, pale, shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. He raised his rifle and fired at something in the Boer lines. His hands on the bolt were steady even though the rest of him was not. Still here. Still holding the rifle. Still doing what the man beside him did. McIntyre, somewhere behind. Fire and adjust. Controlled fire. The sergeant functioning under fire. Again. The man Kettle hated, keeping the section alive. Again. The competence that had been infuriating at Belmont was something else here, something necessary, something Kettle could not bring himself to name because naming it would mean admitting that McIntyre was good at the one thing that mattered. I hate him. I hate that he's good at this. I hate that he's keeping us alive, and I hate that I need him to. A brief glimpse of stairs in the H Company section, off to the right toward the Riverwood. Checking positions. Visible. The officers held the line by being seen, and in the forward trenches at 600 yards, being seen was being a target. Late afternoon. The sun dropping toward the horizon. The firing slacked off. The quiet was worse than the shooting. Word passed down the trench from mouth to mouth, man to man, a whisper that moved faster than any dispatch runner. Attack at 020 tomorrow. Assault. Fixed bayonets. No firing until fired upon. And dig. Mac Donnell gathered the section leaders. Brief, calm, direct. The lieutenant's face showed nothing, not fear, not confidence. Just the flat expression of someone delivering information that would determine whether other men lived or died in 8 hours. Kettle listened. Not to the plan. To the gaps in the plan. The places where room might exist to wriggle. Option 1. Report sick. McIntyre will check. McIntyre always checks. He'll take one look at me and know I'm shamming. The man can smell a lie the way I can smell a wallet. No. Option 2. Fall out during the advance. In the dark with 500 men around me across open ground with Boers firing. Desertion under fire. They shoot you for that. Or they put you in prison, which, no. Even I don't want to test whether the Army's prison is worse than the Dawn. Sniper round cracked somewhere along the line. Distant. Aimed at nothing and everything. Option 3. Just don't stand up. Lee in the trench at 02 while the rest of them go. And then what? Lee here alone while the Boers find me at dawn? A man in a Canadian trench without a Canadian around him? That's not even a death. That's just being found. Option 4. There was no option 4. For the first time in Thomas Kettle's life, there was no angle. Duncan sat against the trench wall. His eyes were closed. The fever hadn't broken. Wouldn't break. He had his bayonet fixed. He was not staying behind. Well, Duncan said. He opened his eyes. The gray in his face was worse in the fading light. At least it's something. Kettle said nothing. Yep, Duncan's going. I'm going. Not because I'm brave. Not because of duty or honor or any of the words they used at the recruiting depot in Toronto that I walked past every day without giving a damn. Because if he dies out there and I'm hiding in a trench, that's a thing I can't live with. Even for me. Even for a man whose entire life has been arranged around not caring about anyone. I think I care about this one. I think that's what this is. That's inconvenient. The sun went down on February 26th. In 8 hours, they would fix bayonets and walk into the dark toward the Boer trenches. Kettle cleaned his rifle because there was nothing else to do. He checked the edge of his bayonet with his thumb. He had thought through every escape route a pickpocket's mind could imagine. There were none. Thomas Kettle was going over the top at 02, though, because a fisherman's son from the Maritimes was going over the top at 020, and that, for a scoundrel who cared about exactly one person in the British Empire, was enough. He was not brave. He was just stuck. 8. Midnight Plan. 2,200 hours. 500 men in a trench with bayonets fixed waiting for 02. The silence was louder than anything Kettle had heard in 9 days at Paardeberg. Not the absence of sound. There was plenty of sound. The river. A man coughing. The muted clink of someone checking his kit for the 4th time. But the silence underneath it, the silence of 500 men who knew what was coming and had nothing left to say about it, that was the loudest thing in Africa. McIntyre materialized behind him. The sergeant moved through the dark efficiently, inevitably, and with the specific intention of making Thomas Kettle's life worse. Kettle. Fire picket. 4 hours. And there it was. Even now. Even with a bayonet charge at 02. Even with the entire battalion sitting in a trench waiting to walk into the dark toward men who wanted to kill them. Even now, the sergeant could not resist one more turn of the screw. Fire picket. 4 hours of standing watch while other men rested. At the end of those 4 hours, Kettle would step over the trench lip exhausted, having not slept, into a silent advance across 450 yards of open ground toward Boer rifles. Every other man in the company would have had those 4 hours to lie still, to close their eyes, to be something less than fully conscious before the dying started. Kettle would have them standing upright, staring into darkness. Yes, Sergeant. What else was there to say? The machinery of the army was built for men like McIntyre. The regulations existed so that NCOs could use them like back alleys to get where they wanted without being seen doing it. A fire picket before an assault was legitimate. Necessary. Someone had to stand watch. That McIntyre chose Kettle every time for every detail was not something you could take to an officer. It was just the war between them, continuing inside the war around them. MacDonnell gathered G Company. The trench ran north-south from the river, 350 yards long, packed with 6 companies, C, D, E, F, G, and H, left to right. Kettle could see Stairs' H Company section off to the right where the trench met the river wood. Beyond the extreme right, 30 Royal Engineers. On the left, about 200 Gordon Highlanders extending the line. Shropshire's somewhere further out, 1,500 yards to the left. A company was across the river on the south bank. Company 300 yards behind in reserve. Wagons 1,000 yards further back. MacDonnell delivered the plan. Simple. Brutal. A plan that sounded reasonable when an officer said it in a calm voice, and became something else entirely when you added darkness and Mosers. Advance at 022, sir. Front rank with bayonets fixed. Rear rank carrying picks and shovels. Silent approach. Do not fire until fired upon. Walk forward. When you cannot walk further, dig. Buchan controls the left side of the assault line. Hell, ATI controls the right. Otter, in the rear, on the left. Kettle listened like he cased a mark, not the words. The distances, 350 yards of trench. 550 yards to the nearest Boer position. 15 paces between the 2 ranks. 1 pace between men. That is a great deal of open space and very little cover per man. In Toronto, I could cross 50 yards in about 2 minutes. In the dark, toward Mosers, it will take 30, if I survive it. He measured the distances the way his fingers used to measure the depth of a coat pocket. Automatically. Professionally. Looking for the angle that would let him take what he wanted and leave before anyone noticed. There was no angle. An open felt with Boer rifles at the end of it did not have angles. It had 550 yards and whatever God thought of him. Fire picket. 4 hours of standing while the world waited. Kettle stood in the trench with his rifle across his chest and stared into the darkness beyond the parapet. Nothing moved. The Boer lines were invisible. No fires, no sound, just the flat black felt running out to a horizon he couldn't see. The fury burned through the first hour. Hot, specific, directed at McIntyre. He's got me standing watch, so I'll be dead on my feet for the charge. He knows it. He wants it. If I die out there 0220, he'll be satisfied that I died tired. The man is a professional bastard, and the army built him a regulation for every cruelty he can imagine. I hate him. I hate that he can do this. I hate that there is no alley, no exit, no play that gets me out of this trench and out of his reach. I hate that I stole a wallet on Queen Street instead of letting the constable catch me. 6 months in the dawn. That's what I could have had. 6 months with a roof and 3 meals and no sergeant. The second hour, the fury cooled. Not gone, fury at McIntyre never went entirely gone, but condensed, hardened into something cold and small that Kettle filed away in the same place he filed every slight and every score. The pickpocket's ledger. Debts owed. Around him, men did what men do before a night assault. Some checked their weapons. Again. Bolt action. Slide. Click. Again. The rhythmic manipulation of steel in the dark. A sound like prayer, mechanical, and soothing. Some wrote letters. By feel, in the darkness, pencil on paper they couldn't see. Folded the letters and tucked them into breast pockets where they would be found if the writer was not alive to post them. Weaves. Mothers. Sweethearts. The men of G Company had people who were waiting for them. People who would open those letters and know. Kettle had no one to write to. The realization landed in the third hour of the watch. Not with drama, with the quiet fact of it. He was from Toronto with no family, he claimed, and no address, he admitted. His mother was a name he tried not to think about. His father was a question mark and a closed door. The constable who chased him down Queen Street was the closest thing to a relationship he'd maintained for more than 6 months. The men around him were folding letters to people who loved them. Kettle had his rifle and his bayonet and a criminal record he was running from. They have people waiting for them. I have a warrant in Toronto and a sergeant's grudge. If I die out here tonight, the only record that Thomas Kettle existed is a constable who's probably forgotten I exist. He was the loneliest man in the trench. He had always been the loneliest man in any room. He'd just never had 4 hours of darkness with nothing to do but notice it. Duncan sat against the trench wall. Closed. His breathing was wrong, too fast, too shallow, the sound of lungs fighting a fever that hadn't broken and wouldn't break. His bayonet was fixed. He was not staying behind. Kettle looked at him. Duncan opened his eyes. Looked back. Either said stay. Either said go. Duncan checked his rifle bolt. The metallic snick of a Lee Enfield being readied by a man whose hands shook with fever, but whose intention was as solid as the maritime granite he'd been raised on. That was the end of the conversation. Something shifted in Kettle during the 4th hour. The fury at McIntyre didn't leave. It never left. But underneath it, in the space where the escape calculations used to run, the space that had been empty since the attack order killed his last angle, something grew. Not courage. He'd have laughed if someone called it that. Something smaller. Something stubborn. Something that looked at a sick man fixing a bayonet in the dark and said, if that man can go forward sick, I can go forward tired. Not because I'm brave. Because I'm not worse than him. Think. Probably. God help me, I'm going because a fisherman's son is going, and I cannot be seen to be less than a man with a fever. Oh, too. Nothing happened. The assault did not begin. A delay. 15 minutes of additional stillness in a trench where 500 men were holding their breath. They can't even start the death march on time. The British Empire runs on railway timetables until the moment it matters, and then nothing works. I have been standing watch for 4 hours, and now I get to stand for 15 more while someone somewhere figures out which direction is forward. 02:15. Movement. The companies rose. MacDonnell's voice, low, steady, the voice of a man who knew that calm was the only thing he could give the men around him. The sections unfolded from the trench. Front rank with bayonets. 15 paces behind, the rear rank with picks and shovels. 1 pace between men. Kettle pushed himself up from where he'd been standing for 4 hours. His legs were cramped. His knees cracked. His feet were numb from the cold ground and the endless, pointless standing. McIntyre's parting gift, the most exhausted man in the assault line. McIntyre was somewhere behind and to the left. Even now, in the dark, walking toward the enemy, Kettle could feel the sergeant's presence, always there, always watching, always ready. He's watching. He's always watching. If I don't go over, he'll know. If I do go over, he'll assign me something worse on the other side. If there is another side. Kettle put 1 boot on the trench lip. Then over. Open ground. The veldt was flat and dark and stretched toward the Boer trenches like a held breath. 450 yards of nothing. Not a tree, not a rock, not a dip in the ground to hide behind. Just dirt and darkness, and, at the end of it, men with rifles. Duncan was beside him. He could hear the man breathing. Hard. Labored. The fever in every breath. But he was here. He was moving. The advance was silent. Bayonets. No firing. Walk forward. 450 yards. 9. The decisive battle. 02:15. Kettle was on his feet and moving forward. Counting steps. His mind needed a task, anything to fill the space where the escape calculations used to run, so he counted. 1. 2. 3. The darkness was absolute. Not Toronto darkness where gaslight leaked from windows and the glow of the city sat on the clouds. This was African darkness. Veldt darkness. The kind of dark that swallowed a man whole and gave nothing back. 4. 5. 6. Ahead and behind him, shapes that were not shapes at all, just sounds. The whisper of boot soles on dry ground. The creak of a leather strap. Breathing. 500 men trying to be silent, and the sound of their trying was louder than any of them individually. The Riverwood was a dark mass to the right, where H Company moved with a partial cover of trees between them and the Boer lines. Company had no such cover. Company was in the open, and F Company was in the open, and the veldt was flat and bare and offered nothing that a man could hide behind. 47. 48. 49. Feed him, 15 paces back, a man carried a shovel. The rear rank. It would dig while the front rank fought. That was the plan. Walk into the dark, survive whatever happened, and dig. Turn open ground into a trench. The Army's answer to everything: if you can't beat it, dig a hole in front of it and wait. His mind was blank. Not empty, blank, like a chalkboard wiped clean. The calculations that had been running since Toronto, the constant assessment of angles and exits and plays, had stopped. There were no angles on the open veldt. There were no exits between a trench line and a Boer rifle. There was only forward. 200. 201. Premature shot from ahead. Single crack, flat and sharp, from somewhere in the Boer lines. Then another. The sound of a bolt being worked. The Boers were awake. The line kept moving. 300. 350. The darkness ahead had a texture now. Something denser than the sky. Earthworks. The Boer trench. Close enough that Kettle could smell it, the same rotten earth smell that hung over every trench line on the Modder. 400. World ended. The fusillade came from 65 yards, and it came all at once. Muzzle flashes ripping the darkness from left to right, a wall of light and sound, and the flat concussive crack of Moser rounds passing so close that Kettle felt the air displace against his face. Not one shot. Not 10. 100 rifles firing into a line walking upright in the dark, and the sound was a wave that pushed him backward and downward and flat into the dirt. He was down, face in the ground. Dirt in his teeth, in his eyes, his hands clawed into the felt. The rifle was under him, tangled in his arms, 65 yards. He could hear the bore rifle bolts. He could hear voices. He could hear men speaking in a language he didn't understand at a distance he could cross in 10 seconds if he were running the other way. Men were hit. Page went down, a sound like a sack of grain dropped, a thud, and then nothing. Withy was hit somewhere to Kettle's left. Fry. Ormond dropped. Riggs was struck, and the sound he made was not a sound that belonged to a living man. Armstrong caught one through the right thigh and managed a strangled grunt before someone pulled him flat. Wasdell was hit in the belly. The sound he made was worse than anything. 4 men dead. 12 hit. His company. In the time it takes to count to 10. Company. Further left, caught it 2. 2 killed. 9 wounded. The company's in the open, without the river woods cover, absorbing the full weight of the Boer fire. Kettle pressed himself into the ground. The same thing he'd done on Bloody Sunday, 9 days ago. Face in the dirt, rifle pointed at the flashes, finger on the trigger. He fired. He had no idea what he was aiming at. He was not aiming. He was hiding behind a Lee infield and pulling the trigger because the recoil was the only proof he had that he was still doing something. This is Bloody Sunday all over again, only closer. 65 yards. I can hear their rifle bolts. I can hear them talking. I am lying in the dirt at a distance I could cross in 10 seconds if I were running away from them, which I would very much like to be doing. Thompson was somewhere to his right. Moving. Functioning. Crawling toward a wounded man, dragging him to cover that didn't exist, then back to his own position, still firing. The man was doing things that required a brain that worked and muscles that obeyed, and Kettle could do neither because his brain was white noise and his muscles had decided that flat was the only position that led to breathing. That man is either very brave or very stupid, and I am not qualified to judge because I am lying flat and firing at nothing. The rear rank began to dig. Behind Kettle, the sound of shovels biting earth. Scraping. The frantic rhythmic sound of men trying to put dirt between themselves and Mosers. Kettle scrabbled at the ground with his hands, with his rifle butt, with anything. Dig. The only order that made sense. Then McIntyre. Even in this. Even in the chaos of a night assault with men dying around him and Boer rifles hammering from that close, the sergeant found his man. He appeared at Kettle's elbow as he always did, without warning, without sound, like a manifestation of the universe's specific contempt for Thomas Kettle. Kettle. Water. Now. Go. The men's canteens were empty. Emptied on the march. Emptied by 4 hours of fire picket. Emptied by fear. Someone needed to crawl to the river and fill them. A legitimate need. A legitimate order. Something an E&C-O could justify on paper. That McIntyre chose Kettle, the man he'd been grinding since the Sardinian, the man he'd put on fire picket 4 hours ago, was both tactically defensible and personally vindictive. The petty tyrant always had a regulation to hide behind. McIntyre had an empty canteen. Yes, Sergeant. Kettle turned, crawled backward, away from the fusillade, away from the front, away from the Boer rifles and the dirt and the men who were dying around him. The relief hit him like a wave. It was physical. His whole body unclenched. His hands stopped shaking. The terror that had been a stone in his chest dissolved. He was going the wrong direction. Away. Backward. Toward the river. McIntyre sent me for water to punish me, and he's just saved my life. I'm going the wrong direction. Away. Thank God. Thank McIntyre. I hate him, and he may have just saved my life, and I hate him for that too. He crawled. The darkness swallowed him. Alone. Between the forward position and the river. Between G Company and the forward trench and the main trench they'd left at 02:15. The sound of the firefight behind him, still savage, still the continuous crack of Mosers and Lee Enfield's muzzle flashes strobing the dark. Ahead, the riverbank. Somewhere. Relief was still flooding through him. The intoxicating, shameful, body-flooding relief of being sent away from the killing. He had orders. McIntyre sent him. He had canteens to fill. He was doing his job. He was not running. He was obeying an order. And then the idea hit. It was not a plan. Thomas Kettle had never had a plan in his life. He'd had instincts and reflexes, and his ability to see an opening and take it before his brain caught up with his hands. This was the same. Impulse. A panicked, furious thing that rose from 9 days of siege, and 4 hours of fire picket, and a sergeant who hated him, and a war he never wanted, and the sounds of Page and Withy and Orman and Riggs who had been beside him and were not beside him anymore. If everyone falls back, nobody has to die. The thought was simple, luminous, the clarity that terror produces. If the whole line pulls back, we're all alive in the morning. The assault failed. 4 dead, 12 wounded, and we're 65 yards from the enemy digging in the dirt. This is madness. If someone gave the order to retire, everyone would go. Everyone would live. He pitched his voice. The pickpocket who had sold a patriotic speech to a captain at the depot, while McIntyre and a constable stood behind him and said nothing, who had stolen 2 bottles of brandy on the Sardinian and walked one straight to the company commander with the other hidden in his tunic, and McIntyre could not prove a thing. He knew how officers sounded. He had been studying them since the depot in Toronto. The cadence, the authority, the calm certainty that came from a commission and a good family. He cupped his hands around his mouth. Retire and bring back your wounded. The voice carried. Not Kettle's voice. Deeper. Harder. The voice of a man with authority cutting through the dark. The same performance that had talked him past a captain at the depot and past McIntyre on the Sardine and the officer's tone, the lying voice applied to 5 words that would change the Battle of Paardeberg. On the left, men heard it. Company. T Company. Company. F Company. Further from the Boer trenches. Less fire. More ground to cover. They heard the order, authoritative, clear, unmistakable, and they did what soldiers do when an officer tells them to retire. They retired. The sound of movement behind and to Kettle's left. Men crawling, dragging wounded, withdrawing. Shadows in the dark moving backward toward the main trench. Buchanan was the last to retire from the left. The lieutenant colonel moving through his retreating companies, ensuring the withdrawal was orderly, the last man back. On the right, where G&H were closest, 65 yards from the Boers, where the firing was loudest, where the night was a solid wall of Moser fire and the sound of shovels and men screaming they didn't hear. Or the firing drowned it out. Ormac, Don L., and Stairs, in their forward positions, heard something and refused to move. The result was the same. 2 companies held. 4 fell back. And Kettle was alone in the dark between the lines. Canteens on his belt, the smell of cordite, and turned earth. The firefight continuing to his right, where G&H were still forward, still digging and firing, and doing the thing he'd just tried to make them stop doing. The realization came slowly, then all at once. My company is still forward. B Company. Don L's company. McIntyre's company. Duncan's company. My company. They didn't hear. I gave the order, and they didn't hear me, and they're still forward, and I am alone in the dark behind the lines with empty water bottles. McIntyre will notice. Don L. will notice. I was sent for water, and I didn't come back. Desertion under fire. They shoot you for that. Or they find out about the voice. The order, retirement. And that's worse. That's everything. That's a firing squad. I have to go back. I have to go back with the water and pretend nothing happened. He crawled forward. toward the Boers, through the open ground, past the space where 4 companies had been and were no longer, back toward the sound of the firefight, back toward the Mosers and McIntyre. The most heroic act of the Battle of Paardeberg, performed because being caught as a coward was worse than being shot. He slid back into the G Company position. Dirt and blood, and the continuous crack of rifles. Men digging. Men firing. Men who had not heard the order and had not moved and were holding because there was nothing else to do. McIntyre was there. Of course McIntyre was there. Where's the water kettle? River was too far under fire, Sergeant? Couldn't fill them. McIntyre stared at him. Sergeant's face was invisible in the dark, but the weight of his suspicion pressed like it always had since the Sardinian. He knew. He always knew. He could smell fraud on Kettle the way Kettle could smell a wallet. But he couldn't prove it. He never could. Get on the line. Dig. Kettle dug. Hours? The rhythm of men who are staying because moving is impossible. Fire. Dig. Fire. The scrape of entrenching tools. The crack of Lee Enfields. The answering crack of Mosers, closer than any enemy fire should be. The distance between 2 trenches full of men who wanted the other to stop. Grady died somewhere in those hours. A sound or an absence. A man who had been digging beside someone and then was not digging beside anyone. The stretcher bearers didn't come. There was nowhere to take him. Dawn crept. The sky went from black to gray to something that was almost light, and in the almost light the Boer trench became visible for the first time. 65 yards. Shockingly close. Earthworks and rifle pits and shapes that had been invisible all night and were now just shapes in the morning. Out 5:15, a voice called from the Boer trench. A pause in the firing. Words in Afrikaans and then in English shouted across the space between the lines. Surrender. The Canadians didn't trust it. They kept firing. In H, entrenched, sighting on the parapet across the gap. Kettle fired. He had been firing all night. His hands were bleeding from the entrenching and the rifle action and the dirt, and he fired because the man beside him fired and the man beside that man fired, and stopping was not something that occurred to any of them. I tried to make them all run, and they held. I tried to empty this trench, and it's full. And now the Boers want to surrender to the 2 companies I couldn't get to leave. There is a God, and he has a sense of humor. For nearly an hour. Continued fire. The skepticism of men who had been lied to by this war since the day they boarded the Sardinian. Then, 6 there. A white flag. Single Boer walked forward from the trench. Hands up. White cloth on a rifle. The firing stopped. The silence was a physical thing. Ringing ears. The absence of concussion. The morning air, clear and still after hours of cordite and gunfire. Kettle could hear the river. He could hear a bird somewhere. Prisoners came in. About 200 from the advanced trench. Bearded, dirty, exhausted. Men who looked no different from the Canadians except for their clothes. They walked toward the Canadian trench with their hands up and their faces blank, and Kettle thought, they look like us. They look exactly like us. It was 6:15. Colville arrived. Staff officers. The machinery of higher command appearing now that the dying was finished. Unconditional capitulation. Grenier and upwards of 4,000. The siege of Paardeberg was over. Kettle stood in the trench he'd dug. His hands were bleeding. His rifle barrel was hot. Duncan was beside him, alive. Sick. Gray. But alive. Breathing. Still here. Round them, not everyone was. Page. Witty. Orman. Briggs. Brady. Names that had been men. Men who had been beside Kettle in the dark at 02:15, who had stepped over the trench lip because every man around them did, who had walked into the fusillade and not walked out. Someone clapped Kettle on the shoulder. A voice from somewhere in G Company, raw and hoarse, We held, boys. Kettle said nothing. He was a pickpocket. He was a coward. He was a hero. He had given the retreat order, and nobody heard it, and the 2 companies that held were being congratulated, and the 4 that fell back were being counted as confusion, and nobody, not McIntyre, not MacDonnell, not Otter, not the Boers walking in with their hands up, nobody would ever know whose voice it had been in the dark. I stole a wallet on Queen Street, and now I've stolen this. 10. Felt graves. Dawn light over Paardeberg. Mater ran red-brown. The battlefield was silent for the first time in 9 days, and the silence was wrong, too large, too empty, the absence of something that had been constant for so long that its removal left a hole in the air. Kettle helped carry a body. A man from his company. He had been beside Kettle in the dark, had stepped over the trench lip at 02:15, had dug when Kettle dug and fired when Kettle fired, and at some point in the hours between midnight and dawn had stopped doing either. The body was heavier than anything Kettle had carried on the march. Heavier than the naval guns at Waterfowl. Heavier than the dead ox in the river. A different kind of weight. For the first time since Toronto, Thomas Kettle had nothing funny to think. The running commentary was not there. Absent. As if the voice had looked at what he was carrying and decided that some things did not deserve commentary. Father O'Leary presided at 07 foot. Brief. Functional. Catholic rite under open sky, no church, no organ, no stone walls. Just exhausted men in dirty uniforms standing at attention while a priest spoke the burial rite over holes in the ground. The graves were shallow. The felt was hard. Men who had dug trenches all night now dug graves, and the shovels made the same sound in the same earth, and if there was a difference between one kind of hole and the other, it was only a matter of who lay in them. Page. Withy. Orman. Briggs. Brady. Nans that had been men. In the trench at 02:15, walked into the dark because every man around them did, and the dark had taken them and not given them back. Kettle stood at the graves, and he did not think about Don Jail. He did not think about Queen Street. He did not think about Wallets or Alleys or McIntyre or the constable who had chased him through the recruiting chaos in Toronto. He stood at the graves, and he was empty. What was there underneath the silence, in the place where the jokes usually were, was a question he could not answer and could not ask. I called a retreat that these men didn't hear. They stayed in the forward trench because my voice didn't carry far enough, or the firing was too loud, or MacDonnell refused to move. They stayed, and they held, and some of them died holding. And I am alive. And the retreat order was mine. I do not know if those 2 facts are connected. I do not know if they would be alive if the whole line had fallen back. I do not know anything. He helped lower a body into the ground. The South African earth was dry and pale and looked nothing like Toronto and nothing like anything. The weight left his hands and became the weight of the earth, and Father O'Leary said words that Kettle heard but did not process, and the flies were already gathering. The battalion marched into the captured Boer Lager of 9:30. The Lacher from inside was everything the siege had imagined, and nothing it had prepared for. Wagons smashed and overturned. The stench of 9 days' occupation by men, women, animals, and the dead of all 3. Piles of spent brass. At Child's shoe, in the mud. The detritus of a defense that had ended not with a battle cry, but with a white flag. Kettle moved through it and felt nothing. Roberts arrived at 16 Holy. Clean uniform. Mounted. Staff officers arrayed behind him like a display in a shop window. Everything the soldiers were not. The field marshal looked like a recruiting poster, composed, imperial, the face of the war as it was supposed to be rather than the war as it was. He thanked the Canadians, credited them as instrumental in the capture of Cronje and his force, said words that would appear in reports and newspapers and histories. Otter stood before the battalion and delivered the words that mattered more, the words from the commanding officer who had been in the trench, who had been in the rear during the assault, who had written the report that would go to London. He credited Stairs and MacDonnell by name. Pertinacity. Kettle heard the word. Pertinacity. He nearly choked. Pertinacity. Stubborn courage. They held because they didn't hear the order to retire. My order. I gave the order, and they didn't hear it, and now they're being praised for their courage in ignoring me. I tried to empty that trench, and I failed, and the failure is being called pertinacity. I am standing in a victory parade for a battle I tried to stop. The British Empire is built on misunderstandings and the inability of officers to hear orders in the dark. I have contributed to this tradition. I expect a medal. The scoundrel's bravado reassembled one final time over something that was not funny at all. McIntyre was nearby, watching. The sergeant said nothing during the praise, but his eyes, as always, missed nothing. He looked at Kettle during Otter's speech. One look. The look from the Sardinian, from the brandy incident, from every moment when McIntyre knew, absolutely and without evidence, that Kettle was guilty of something. Does he suspect? He always suspects. He can never prove anything. That is the fundamental arrangement of our war. He knows what I am, and I know he knows, and neither of us can do anything about it. The look passed. McIntyre turned away. Jones and the surrender flag were visible in the background, the white cloth from dawn, now a trophy. Prisoners sat in groups. The lodger settled into the bureaucracy of capitulation. February 28th. The brigade moved to Codo's Rand, about 5 miles upriver. Paardeberg receded behind them geographically. It did not recede from Thomas Kettle's head. It would not recede from Thomas Kettle's head for the rest of his life. Men fell sick in waves. The contaminated water. 9 days of drinking the same water that had carried dead animals and dead men, and the waste of 2 armies, and now the river was collecting its bill. 350 cases of enteric fever in the battalion. 350 men who had survived the siege and the assault and the bayonet charge, struck down by water. Duncan went down on the 3rd day at Codo's Rand. Duncan had marched beside Kettle through 23 miles of night. Had gripped his arm in the dark on Bloody Sunday. Had said, well, at least it's something, and fixed his bayonet and gone forward with a fever. Had been beside Kettle at dawn when the white flag came, and the battle ended, and the congratulations started. On his back, burning, shaking under a blanket that was too thin for a man whose body had declared war on itself. Well, at least its something was gone. What was left was a man shaking and the sound of his breathing, which was the wrong sound, too fast, too wet, too much like the river. Kettle sat with him. I can pick a pocket in under 3 seconds. I can steal a bottle of brandy from the officer's stores. I can forge an authoritative voice and call a retreat that 4 companies obey. I cannot fix this. My hands don't work here. Quick fingers are worth nothing when the enemy is inside your friend's blood. He sat with Duncan through the afternoon. The field hospital, such as it was a row of blankets under canvas. Men on their backs. Men shaking. Duncan opened his eyes once, looked at Kettle. The gray eyes that had seen through him on the Sardinian. So where'd you really come from? Were glassy now, focused on something Kettle couldn't see. Kettle didn't say it's going to be fine. He didn't say you'll pull through. But there were lies he couldn't tell, even now. He sat with his hands in his lap, still. For once in his life, completely still. Duncan did not die that afternoon. He did not recover. His eyes closed and his breathing continued wrong, wet, too fast, and Kettle sat beside him in Codo's Rand while the war moved on without either of them, and whether the fisherman's son from the Maritimes lived or died was a question the river would answer in its own time. 9 months passed. Spring. Summer. The war continued. Paardeberg became a name, a battle, a victory, a thing that appeared in newspapers and speeches. The Canadians became a symbol. Something politicians could point to and say, we did that. November 29th, 1900, Southampton. The battalion stepped off the ship onto English soil. Clean uniforms, polished boots. The dirt of South Africa washed away by ship's laundry in the simple passage of time. They looked like a recruiting poster. Everything the war had not been. Then London. Then Windsor. November 30th. Windsor Castle. Stone walls and towers and the weight of the British Empire arranged in architecture. The battalion formed up in the courtyard. Parade order. Straight lines. The precision of men who had spent 9 days in filth at Paardeberg now standing at attention before the sovereign. Queen Victoria reviewed the battalion. Old. Frail. The face on every coin and every portrait in every government office Kettle had ever been hauled into by a constable. She moved past the ranks in a wheeled chair, and the men stood rigid, and the empire performed itself in the courtyard of its oldest castle. The Prince of Wales was present. The future Edward VII would be king in 2 months. Though he didn't know it yet, Victoria would die in January. He moved down the ranks behind his mother, shaking hands here and there, the careful informality of a man who understood that soldiers needed to feel seen. Thompson received the Queen's scarf, one of 4 given to Colonial Corps. Knitted by Victoria herself, presented for bravery on February 18th and 27th. Thompson stepped forward and the battalion watched, and the scarf was placed in his hands, and he accepted it with the straight-backed silence of a man who had earned it. Kettle watched. Thompson earned it. He was moving when the rest of us were flat. He was functioning when I was hiding behind my rifle. He deserves the scarf. He deserves everything they're giving him. What I deserve is a trial. Then the Prince of Wales stopped. In front of Kettle. The future King of England looked at Private Thomas Kettle, pickpocket, pressed man, scrounger, coward, the man who gave the unidentified retreat order at Paardeberg, and extended his hand. Well done, soldier. Well, Kettle took the hand. The same hand that had picked pockets on Queen Street. The same hand that had stolen a brandy bottle on the Sardinienne. The same hand that had dug a trench 65 yards from the Boers. The same hand that had cupped around his mouth in the dark and called, "Retire and bring back your wounded," in a voice that was not his own. The same hand that had been bleeding when the white flag came. "Thank you, sir." One hand. Right. The shaking hand. The same hand that had picked a wallet on Queen Street in what felt like another lifetime. As the royal grip released, Kettle's fingers found the chain, the clasp, the weight. The brush, the dip, the pull, 3 motions that looked like one. The watch was in his coat pocket before the prince had taken 2 steps. He smiled. The pickpocket's smile. I am exactly what you think I am. I have shaken hands with the future King of England. I have stolen a wallet, a uniform, a place in the army, a retreat order in the dark, and a pocket watch from the future King of England. I am the most successful thief in the history of the British Empire, and nobody will ever know. He marched past the Queen. He looked straight ahead. Not at the flags. Not at the crowds. Not at the stone walls of Windsor Castle, or the towers, or the pageantry, or the soldiers in their clean uniforms standing in straight lines in a courtyard that had never heard a Moser. He looked straight ahead where the dead were. Page, Withy, Ormond, Riggs, Brady, and Duncan, somewhere between alive and gone. Thomas Kettle, the most successful thief in the history of the British Empire, carried Paardeberg inside him the way the felt carried the graves. Permanently, silently, without ceremony. 11. Roll of Honor. The preceding chapters are fiction. What follows is not. These are the real names of real men who went to South Africa and did not come home. Killed in action, Paardeberg, 18 February 1900. On the first day at Paardeberg, the Royal Canadian Regiment lost 18 killed and 60 wounded in their baptism of fire along the Modder River. Of the dead, 14 names survive in the official parliamentary nominal roll. Rank, name, Ma. Scott, Bully, TWE. Jackson, Bit TA. Mondro, PJ. Todd, Pay, JH. Somers, Bit Pi R. Smith, Bit, JA. Donegan, what? White, D. JH. Kindley, PTWTT. Manion, Mix. BRE. Lewis, KOT. Burns, the CEE.
E.
Jackson, B-T-C-H. Barry,
Cowardice.
Royal Canadian Regiment, fallen in South Africa. 68 men of the Royal Canadian Regiment died during the South African deployment. 39 were killed in action or died of wounds. 29 died of disease, accidents, or other causes. The regiment's dead spanned the full campaign from the first assault at Paardeberg to the long months of garrison and advance that followed. Died of disease. Rank, name, location, date, by, at, lat. B.D. Bloemfontein, 14, April 1900, Val CPL. A.F. Van Orman, Bloemfontein, 7th, June 1900, Paardeberg. Haynes, Johannesburg, 6 June 1900. Disease killed more men than combat. The contaminated Modder River, the same water the regiment drank, cooked with, and washed wounds in during the siege, spread enteric fever through the ranks for months after the guns fell silent. Bloemfontein, the first major city occupied after Paardeberg, became a death camp of typhoid. Canadian casualties of the South African War, 1899 to 1902. Canada sent 7,368 men to South Africa. Of these, 89 were killed in action, 135 died of disease, and approximately 267 died in total when accidents and other causes are included. Disease killed more Canadians than Boer rifles, a consistent feature of that war and of every war before it. From the Book of Remembrance. The official Book of Remembrance records 280 Canadian dead. The following are drawn from its rolls, excluding those already named above. No additional names from the Book of Remembrance sample are available beyond those listed in the Paardeberg Killed in Action roll. The 6 names confirmed in the sample, Dunnigan, Finlay, Jackson, Mannion, Smith, and White, all appear in the table above. The full Book of Remembrance, held in the Memorial Chamber of the Peace Tower in Ottawa, contains 280 names. Each day, a page is turned. Sources. Sessional Paper Number 35A, 1901. Official Nominal Roll of the Canadian Contingent, tabled in the Parliament of Canada. Contains the confirmed killed in action list for Paardeberg, 18 February 1900. Toronto Garrison Memorial Tablet inscribed names of Toronto area soldiers killed in action and died of disease during the South African War, including Royal Canadian Regiment personnel. Book of Remembrance, South African War, held in the Memorial Chamber, Peace Tower, Parliament Hill, Ottawa. Records the names of 280 Canadians who died during the war 1899 to 1902. Lieutenant Colonel W.D. Otter, Battle Report, 2 March 1900. Official after-action report of the Battle of Paardeberg, detailing Canadian casualties and unit dispositions.